This is going to be one of the most important videos in this whole course, so make sure you pay attention well. Previous videos I already mentioned masking, adjustment layers, smart objects, but these are the key features which will help you to be able to work non-destructively. Now, what non-destructive workflow means in Photoshop is that whatever you do, you will be able to make changes to later. So if you apply an adjustment, you will still be able to make changes to that adjustment. If you make a selection and you combine different images together, you will always be able to improve the edges of that selection. Or when you are not sure how big you want an item to be, you will always be able to resize it up and down until you find the right size in your composition. But before we get into the three main non-destructive techniques, let me just get back to the basics and talk a little bit about using layers. Well, first of all, here's a tool we haven't used so far, which is a very useful tool called Spot Healing Brush Tool. Now, this is a tool that we will talk about more in the retouching videos, but for now, I just would like to show you what this does. If I zoom a little bit closer, you can see there's a couple of details here in the background, which I'm going to remove from the image. So this tool is also like a brush. You can make the brush size bigger or smaller with the square brackets, and then all you need to do is to paint over a detail that you wish to remove, and it will be gone just like magic. So let's remove that as well. So you see, this is a great feature, and we can use it also to remove a couple of other details like that one there, or this building in the background. And I think that's pretty much it. Maybe these buildings as well. I want to make this scene look completely empty of buildings, and this might not be a perfect replacement here, but it's actually not that bad either after drawing over it a couple of times. And now if I zoom back, I think I'm pretty happy with the result. So we removed every sign of civilization apart from the path here, but I actually like that old mountain path, and I'm going to use that for my composition. All these changes that I've done with the healing brush are now burnt into the background layer. So if I change my mind and I want to remove them, the only thing I can do is to undo them. And remember, in Photoshop we have to use step backward to undo more than the last step. But to be able to see these steps, you can also use this panel called the History panel. Now, if you don't see that, you can always go to the Window menu and you will find it there. The History panel lets you visualize all the previous steps you've done in the Photoshop file. So if I switch to another document like this one, the History panel will be empty. It just says Open, and it shows how the image looked when I opened it up. So if I switch back to my other document, that has already a history of changes, and I can actually go back and see how it was before all the spot healing brushes. It's actually there, and then I can again go further up or down in the list to see all the changes I've done. So you can see the changes happening in the background, and I can go back and forth. If I want, I can even go back all the way to the beginning. So I can go all the way back the way the document was opened. There is a setting for how many steps the History panel will be able to remember. If you go to Preferences, which will be on PC under the Edit menu, Preferences, and then choose the Performance tab, in which you will find the History States option. Now this can be increased up to 1000, but what I recommend to use is somewhere around 100 or 50, so don't increase it too high because that will be quite a lot of memory consumption, and it might eventually slow down the computer. So if I come back to my image, and let's just say I make an adjustment as well, so I go to Image, Adjustments, let's just say I turn it black and white, and I click OK, you will see that also as a step in the History panel. If I then go back again, maybe use another adjustment like Levels, and then increase the contrast with one of these presets, and then click OK again, you see Levels is also in the History panel. So once again, if I go back to before the adjustments, I can see it, or I can go step by step through the adjustments that I applied. For the History panel, we also have some options from the History panel menu. If you click on History Options, What I like to turn on, additionally to the default options, is the automatically create new snapshot when saving. That means whenever you save your document, it will automatically create a saved state. The only problem with both the history steps and the snapshots is they only will be available while you are working in the document. Once you close it, this will be erased completely. So while you are working, you can rely on the history panel, but once you close a document and you come back to it, you will have to rely on the way you work with layers. So let me demonstrate this to you. So here we still have the option to go back all the way to the beginning without the retouching, or I can go back to the retouched image, or I can choose which adjustment I want to have on this image. But once I save this document, so I go to File, Save As, and let's just save it as a PSD file, the Photoshop document. I'm going to click on Save. Then, if I close this document by going to File, Close, and open it back again, so I go to File, Open, and choose the image which we just saved. It should be here at the end. So there's the PSD file. Click Open. You will see that it comes up here in the history panel, but it just says Open. So I just wanted to show you that the history, states, and the snapshots won't be accessible after you close a file. They will be always wiped. And there's no way around that. But what we can do is, instead of relying on history, we will rely on layers and other non-destructive techniques, which I'm going to explain now. So let me just close the history panel, and I will close this document as well. Instead, I'm going to open back the original file, so the one we had opened before. Let me just scroll down. That's the one we are looking for. And now, instead of doing the retouching on the image itself, I will already start working non-destructively for that and create an additional layer. So I click on the new layer icon here at the bottom of the layers panel, and then I'm going to rename this layer and call it Retouch. Then, using the Spot Healing Brush tool, I will just do the same thing what we've done before. I zoom slightly closer just so we can see what we are doing. But to make this tool work on this separate layer, we have to have the Sample All Layers option checked. So it's very important to have that enabled before we start working with it on a separate layer. And I'm going to paint over the details I wish to remove, like these benches here. Just slightly draw over that detail. Then let's go to this side. We have this bird flying here. I remove that. We have that building in the background. Remove that. And then we have also some signs of houses here in the background. Let me remove those as well completely. You might need to draw over details a couple of times until you get a good result with this tool, because it is randomly samples from the image. It might take some time until you get a good edge, for example, in this case. So I just had to click on it a couple of times. But don't worry, I'm going to explain how to use this tool later on. For now, that's all I wanted to do. But while I'm zoomed closer, I can show you turning this layer on and off. Now I can see that everything is on a separate layer, which means I can always reveal the original details, or I can see my retouch details if I have the retouch layer turned back on. That already is a big difference, because it means at any point I can change my mind, and even having the retouch layer turned on, I can decide to maybe just show that building in the background. So all I would have to do is use the eraser tool. Being on the retouch layer, I just have to paint over that detail, and you see it will be revealed. So let me just zoom closer, paint over it, and it reveals it. And then again, if I want, I can recreate that with the Spot Healing Brush tool. And actually, I think it even turned out better than before. So you can see the flexibility already in this workflow. But to demonstrate another interesting feature in Photoshop, I'm going to intentionally make a mistake. Selecting my background layer now, and not being on the retouch layer, I will make a change there. So something that's going to be very obvious, like let's say this tree in the background, I'm going to increase my brush size and paint over that detail. Now this part here clearly got messed up. So we can see before and after, but I will leave it like that as an intentional mistake, and then we will come back to it later. For now, I would like to continue with some adjustments. So let me zoom back to see the whole image. And instead of applying the adjustment from the image menu and choose it from there, I'm going to create adjustment layers. Once again, to work non-destructively, and also because I already have 2 layers, so if I wanted to change the colors or contrast, I would have to reapply it on both the retouch layer and the background layer. It just would make it more complicated. So if I go to the adjustments panel, which if you can't see, you can go to Window, Adjustments. So this panel will offer you all the different type of adjustments. And one of the adjustments I would like to use in this case is the Curves adjustment layer. So I'm going to select that one and slightly increase the brightness of the overall image. You see, all you have to do is to drag the curve up or down. Dragging it down will make it darker, dragging it up will make it brighter. I felt like it was slightly too dark before, but we can always check before and after by turning the adjustment layer off. So if you turn it off, that was before, and this is after. But let's add another adjustment layer as well. If I go to the adjustments, we can choose, for example, Vibrance. So let's add this one, which will be another adjustment layer. And with this, we can increase the intensity of colors in the image or decrease them. So you can make it less saturated or more saturated. Once again, I'm going to talk about adjustment layers in more detail. For now, I just wanted to have 2 layers here, and we can see before and after these layers if I turn them off and turn them back on again. And by double clicking on them, you can always get the options back, so you can adjust whatever amount you used before. And the best thing about these is that they stay with the file if you save this as a Photoshop file, because they are separate layers. Now let's bring in 2 images into this composition. I'm going to switch to the balloon we had before, and I have a selection saved in here. So I go to Select, Load Selection, and there's the balloon saved. So I click OK. So now that we have that selected, instead of just drag and dropping this image, I might want to refine the selection later, and that is why I'm going to save it as a mask. So clicking on the little icon here at the bottom will turn this selection into a mask, and now I can move it into the other image. So I'm just going to drag it over to the tab of the other image, then let go there. So hover over it and let go, and you see that the image will come in with its mask. So it's been placed here together with its mask, and that is quite a nice position there for the image. But just to prove that the whole image came in, I can shift click on its mask to show the original background, and then shift click again to show the masked version. And whenever I want to refine the mask, I could select the mask and make adjustments on it. Let's do the same thing with this girl. So I'm just going to select another image once again, and I go to Select, Load Selection, and I have this person selected already, so I can just click OK. Once again, let's turn this into a mask, and then move this once again onto our other image. And let go, we'll place her here. Now, that looks already quite good, but I want to see the road a bit more, so I will probably have to make her slightly smaller. At the moment, she just covers up too much of the image. Before I make her smaller, though, I have to decide whether that's a final decision, because once you use the free transform tool and start resizing layers, you will also lose quality or resolution, and you will end up having only those pixels available, whatever size you end up with. Of course, you can resize again and make layers bigger, but on the way, you are losing quality. And just to demonstrate that to you, I'm going to make a duplicate of her by holding down the Alt or Option key with the Move tool and create a duplicate. And then this version on the right, I'm going to turn into a smart object. So I go to Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object, or you can always right click on the layer and choose Convert to Smart Object from there. So once it is a smart object, it will have that little icon on the bottom right corner of the thumbnail, which represents that this is a smart object. And then if I select both layers and use the free transform option on them to resize them, we will be able to see what happens. So let me just resize them by holding down Shift key and dragging the corner points. Let's say I'm not sure how big I want them to be. So I'm going to make an extreme resize option, something like that. Accept that. And then let's say later on I decide I want them to become bigger again. So use free transform once more, make the two layers bigger, and you will see straight away that the Smart Object version is very nice and clear still, while the other one, the normal layer, lost a lot of quality on this transformation. So when I press enter, it will still look better, but once I zoom closer, you will see that we are losing a lot of details from there. So while this one has plenty of details on the hair and on the fur coat, this one will have much less detail, so it becomes much blurrier. And the more times you will resize things up and down, the more details you will lose on the way. So that's why it's important to also use smart objects. And the smart way of doing everything is that you first create your selection, save the mask, and then turn the layer into a smart object. That way, the mask is going to be saved within the smart object, and even that is going to be preserved in the original size. I'm going to talk about smart objects in a separate video. For now, I just wanted to demonstrate that this is also part of the non-destructive workflow. So I'm going to delete the other version on which we lost the quality, and I'm going to just move this layer here to the side. And now we can freely resize this because we know it's a smart object, so we won't lose quality on it. So use Edit Free Transform or Control or Command T, and let's drag her slightly down, something like that. Let's place her somewhere around here, and that is a quite nice composition. Of course, we can always decide to move the balloon a little bit further away to the left or further up. It doesn't even have to be completely in the image. But then again, if I want to resize the balloon, remember before I would use the free transform on it, I would right click, convert to smart object, and then I can be sure that I can always recover the original size of the balloon. So if I decide to make it smaller and place it somewhere in the background like that, I will still have the option to increase the size and bring it back to the foreground. So if I go back to Edit Free Transform, I not only can resize it, but I also know exactly what was the original size. You can see here in the width and height, I can see a percentage which tells me exactly how much bigger this was. So if I increase it, I know exactly when I reach the 100%. And of course I can go beyond that as well, but try not to go more than 120% of the original size. That is still a safe size where you won't really see pixelation or blurry edges. I actually like the original size and placement, so I'm going to keep this balloon somewhere here. But now if we look at our layers panel, we can see that these two images that we brought in first were masked out from their original background, and then they were turned into smart objects. Then we also have adjustments for the background, which makes the background brighter and also more vibrant in colors. And by the way, these adjustment layers will only affect whatever layers are underneath them. So for example, if I select the girls layer and I drag it below the adjustments, you will see it will also get affected. So once again, if I drag it back above them, it's not affected. Once it's below them, it will also be affected. And I think actually it's good to have these adjustments on her as well. I probably don't need it on the balloon because it's already quite bright, but I can of course also include that if I just drag it below the adjustment layers. So now you could see the 4 most important ways of working non-destructively in Photoshop. First of all, using layers for changes, which is like my retouch layer, remember. Then use adjustment layers for adjustments. Use layers with masks for removing their background, and then turn them into smart objects when you want to resize them. So this is really the way you should work in every scenario. But of course, there's plenty to learn about masking, adjustment layers, and smart objects as well. So these will be our next big topics. But to finish off this video, I would like to return to that detail which I messed up in the background. Let's select the background layer because that's where this mistake was committed. And I'm going back to my history panel in which I can see a lot of steps. So I can actually see all the steps I've done in this composition. I can even click on them to see how I managed to get to this point where we are at the moment. But when I scroll up, notice that there is this little brush icon next to the original image. So the way this image was opened. That icon represents the source of the history brush. So I'm going to have the history brush selected, which is here in the toolbar. I just increase my brush size. And I'm going to draw over the part that I messed up earlier. And once again, just like magic, Photoshop can recover all those details that we lost on that layer. Isn't that amazing? So this, of course, will only be available while you are still working on the current document. Once the document is saved, closed, and reopened, you wouldn't be able to do this because this step relies on the history, and the history brush will only work if you have the correct layer selected and the correct state which you want to recover. But of course, the history brush source can be added to any of the stages in your editing. So you can sample from other points as well. And just to demonstrate, if I select a state after the healing brush steps and I paint over that part again, I can recover the mistake I've done once again. Then if I put the history brush source back to the original image, I can also once again paint over it and get the original details without the mistake. So let's just save this document. I go to File, Save, because there's one last thing I wanted to explain about history states. So I just save it, replace the one that I created earlier. And then if I look at the history panel here on the top, because we use that custom setting for the history states, I can see that now we have another snapshot and it actually shows us the date. There's the original image and this is the one that we changed. So let's zoom out and see it in total. That was before, this is after. But what is also important is that you have to make sure that whenever you jump back and forth in the history panel, you should be careful, because if I go back further in time, like to here, where I don't have those two other images placed in, and I make a change, let's say I go to my retouch layer, and using the retouch tool, I'm trying to remove another tree detail, for example, that there. And what happened is that anything that was beyond that point in the history, so all my previous steps got wiped or erased. Now they are lost. And I wouldn't be able to even go back now because I can only go back in history, but I can't go further ahead. So when you go back to a previous step and these other steps here get faded, that means if you do now something, whatever that will be, it will wipe everything that's faded from the history. So that is why it's important to save your file. And with every save, you will have a snapshot here on the top to which you can come back to. So snapshots are useful, but most important thing to do is to work non-destructively using layers, adjustment layers, masking, and smart objects. So to learn more about these important techniques, let's first focus on masking in the next videos.